Welcome back. Now, in this section of our course, we are going to take a deep look into GraphQL. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. This GraphQL section is going to be pretty complex and it's going to be pretty long. There is a lot that we have to cover about how to use GraphQL on our front end, but most importantly, what GraphQL is, what problems it attempts to solve, and how you as a front-end developer need to look out for GraphQL in terms of what you can do in your career to best understand what it brings to the development table. Now, in order for us to understand what GraphQL is, we need to understand the problem that GraphQL is trying to solve. And in order for us to understand this, we need to first understand that what GraphQL is actually something for the backend. So GraphQL is actually a server language that wraps around an existing database or server that you can make requests against in a different way from the way that we have been up until this point. Now, if that seems confusing for you, don't worry, I'm about to explain what I mean. But in order to do that, we have to first look back at our backend diagram. So if we look back at this diagram, what this diagram represents is a typical REST backend server. So a server will expose different endpoints that have different things that they can do when you on a front-end application or client make some kind of request to it. So for example, if we had this users endpoint that our backend exposed, and we made a request to this endpoint, so whatever the URL is of this backend server, let's imagine it's something like our application as the URL name. So crownclothing.com/API/users, I want to request from my application for all of the users from this endpoint. Well, this endpoint would process whether or not I, on my front-end application, am allowed to access all of these users, like any of the data that I'm requesting. And then if the code that somebody wrote on the backend authorizes us and says, okay, that's cool, then it's going to send us back all of the data related to all the users that we requested. Now, how that actually looks in code is not important for us because this backend server code is something that we don't need to code. But this is going to be very similar to kind of like how we worked with the JSON placeholders API, as well as how we're working with Firestore. We're essentially making requests to specific endpoints that we have inside of our server in order to get some data. Now, if we wanted data related to, let's say, for example, all of the posts for a specific user, if you were to imagine this application to be something that has posts and comments, right? Maybe like a blog of some kind or a forum. Well, our application would have to make a request to a different endpoint where we would maybe have to pass the user ID in as part of the data of our requests to this endpoint for all of the posts for some specific user. So we would send in that user ID to this URL. Maybe we would just even pass the user ID as the URL parameter, the way that we have done before with our collection page. And then this, again, the backend server would determine whether or not we have the correct authorization to access this user's posts. And then if we do, it would send those posts back to us. Finally, let's say we wanted comments. Again, there might be a different endpoint as well for that post based on the ID to get the comments, and we would make the request. The server would again have to re-authenticate us and figure out if we are allowed to access those comments. And then if we are, they'd send those comments back to us. So this is how most front-end applications work with backend servers in any capacity. If we wanted to make updates to the database, like let's say we modified the post that we got and we wanted to change the title. Well, again, there would have to be maybe the same endpoint that was opened, but we would send a different type of request to this backend in order to make an update. Or if we wanted to create a post, similar, exact same thing, but a different request again. Now, this paradigm of using these endpoints is what's called the REST paradigm, which stands for Representational State Transfer. And it follows the paradigm of you either making GET requests, POST requests, update requests, or delete requests. And it's exactly as they sound. If you want to get some data, you make a GET request. If you want to post some data, meaning you want to create something new, you make a POST request. If you want to update something, you'd make an update request. And then if you want to delete something, you make a delete request. So that's the main idea behind REST and how we on the front end interact with this REST backend server. But imagine a scenario, and you can kind of see where the problem arises when we look at this specific scenario, where let's say from my web application, the user navigates to the post ID/comments section, meaning that they want all of the comments related to some specific post. In order for us on our web application to get that specific thing, we need to know the post ID. In order to get the post ID, we might need to have gotten it from our posts first related to our user, which we would have to get with a user ID. In order to get our user ID, we'd have to make a query to the user's endpoint asking for our user data. So in order to get the comments, we'd have to make 3 different requests to the backend in order to get the data. We'd first get the users, find our user, get the user ID, make a request to this new endpoint with that user ID to get the posts related to our user, and then from our posts, get the post ID for the post we want, send it to this backend so that we can get the comments related to that post. It's a very expensive solution, and it seems like it's a lot of steps that we have to do just to get this kind of information. Now, the other thing too is that we might get all of the data on these comments or on the posts that we don't need. As we've seen with a lot of the data that we handle, a lot of the times, the only thing we need is the ID, or maybe the title or the name, right? We only need 1 or 2 properties on that data model. If instead you imagine these pieces of data have a lot of data on them, let's say there's like 30, 40, 50 pieces of data that it needs to serve for all kinds of different purposes, well, we're overfetching data. We're getting way too much data that we on the front end don't care about when all we really want is the ID or the name. Well, these 2 problems are actually the main things that GraphQL tries to solve. Let's look at what GraphQL does instead. So in order to use GraphQL, you actually convert your REST backend server into a GraphQL server. Now instead what happens, right away, just by looking at this image, what we see is that instead of having multiple different endpoints that we can hit from our server, our GraphQL server just exposes one single endpoint, usually called the /GraphQL endpoint. And from this endpoint, our application makes all of its requests for all of its data, whether to get data, update data, create data, or delete data, all to this one endpoint. Secondly, what we need to do in order to make a request to this GraphQL endpoint is we need to pass it either a query or a mutation. Now, we'll talk about mutations later, but the main difference is that a query is where we ask for data and a mutation is where we want to modify data. But essentially, they all take a similar shape. And the shape looks very much like a JSON object. So let's look at this first example here. Let's say we wanted to get all of our posts from the GraphQL endpoint. Well, we'd make a request and we would pass in this weird looking object. And what this object says is that I want the posts. which is the data model name that our server is aware of, that knows that posts is related to the posts data in the database that it needs to access. So what happens is that we request for posts, and then we pass it this object-looking shape, and inside we give it the properties that we want the server to give back to us of the posts data that we want. Meaning that what we would pass in if we only wanted ID, title, and content would just be those fields. We would just pass the ID field, the title field, and the content field if that's all we wanted. If we didn't want the title field, we just remove it from this object and we pass that. And then the server, if successful and authorizes us to receive this information, will send us back an array of these posts where each of those post data individually only have the ID and the content variables on them. So this right away allows us to fetch exactly the data that we want. Also, what else this does is we don't have to be aware of all of the different endpoints that we need to be able to access in order to get any of the data that we needed. So if, for example, we suddenly had this new feature that was built on the back end in order to fetch data related to, say, something like pages, or say something like your friends. Well, they would have to make a new endpoint for us, maybe called friends, and then we would have to make, on our front end, an awareness to that new endpoint and then make requests to it. Which means that in some ways, maybe we have to add more things to our application on our front end just so that we're aware that this new endpoint exists for this new feature. Well, with a GraphQL server, that never has to happen. Because whatever the backend server changes, we don't need to be aware that the new endpoint happened. We just need to know from our application that this shape of this data looks a certain way and we can query for certain things. So then we would just make that request and our endpoint is always going to be this one GraphQL endpoint. Alternatively, if we wanted specific data, like let's say one specific user based on an ID, if we already were aware of the ID, well, we just pass that ID in to the query itself as well, asking for the user object, telling it I want it by this ID, and then again, we could define the shape of the data that we want. If we wanted the ID, if we wanted the name, right? If we wanted whatever other properties like email, address, it doesn't matter. You would make the request inside of this object. But now it gives us singular access still to that one endpoint. Now, what happens if we want, say, a specific post that belongs to our user ID, but we also want the comments that might be related to that post? Well, now, on the backend, they would essentially define that relationship between these comments objects and this post. And you don't need to know too much about what that relationship code looks like, but all you need to know is that what happens is that it allows us from our front end to request for that specific post from the specific user ID. And then from there, we would be able to, again, say which properties of the post we want. Let's say we want the ID, the name, whatever. But then we also want the comments related to this post. So we would say the comments, which would be a property, as we see with our collection items, right? How we have the items that gives us the array of the items that belong to the collection. Well, here we would say the same thing. I want the comments, and then of those comments, I want, and then we can list what properties on those comment data that we want. So I want the ID of the comment, I want the content of the comment, and that's it. And then this request would give us back all of those objects with the comments as well as a property of our post object data. So this is kind of a high level look at what is happening and what GraphQL does differently from typical REST APIs. Now, if you haven't worked too much with REST APIs, some of this you might not fully empathize with as far as the problem goes. But if you ever go onto an application that is quite large and working with a REST API to do a lot of its features, you will encounter these issues that I've talked about. But of course, these problems are not extremely significant that every application is going to start switching over to GraphQL. Lots of applications are built and fully working and very successful using this traditional REST backend server paradigm and having front-end applications query against new endpoints, right? There's lots of services and processes and workflows that deal with how we on the front end work with this kind of API. But GraphQL is just a very interesting new look and approach to this kind of thing. Now, that's a lot of concepts, and there's a little bit more that you'll only really have to encounter as you get more advanced with working with GraphQL. But from a high level, that's the value proposition that it brings to the table. Now, in the next lesson, we're actually going to look at a live example of how we're going to make a request against a GraphQL server for this data that we were talking about.